Welcome back to the show, everybody. Joining us now on set is Steve Minichiello, who teaches a class at Worcester State on the Beatles. Steve, thank you so much for being here. Nice to see you, as always. So you teach a class on the Beatles. What fascinates you about the Beatles?
I think the thing that fascinates me the most is how they changed everything. For instance, if the Beatles were here, the set that we're looking at would be full of color and excitement instead of just the blue.
Instead of just plain blue.
But they changed music. They changed the way music is played. They changed how music was produced, how album covers are created, how rock music is portrayed in movies or on radio. And then huge cultural changes also. The dress, how people dressed. Long hair became a new fashion. There was so many different aspects of them. And I think probably the most fantastic thing is they affected the news much like any prime minister or president or pope or any world leader would. Their movements were followed in the 60s just as closely as political leaders were.
And this was unheard of for any musician or group at the time too, right?
The only person that really made that much of an impact was Elvis, but that was a shorter period of time. And the huge difference is that Elvis was a fantastic performer and a groundbreaker, but the fact is he never really played his own music. He played guitar, but he wasn't a virtuoso. We always had session musicians with him. And he never wrote music or created music. Other people wrote songs for them. The Beatles changed all that. They were the singer-songwriters, the original singer-songwriters.
We can break up the Beatles' career in a bunch of different eras. What's your favorite era for the Beatles?
Oh, that will depend on what day of the week it is. I've always been fascinated with the pre-Beatles, before they became popular. What was it like for them?
When they were touring through Hamburg.
Yes, when they were doing small tours in Europe and residencies in Hamburg, Germany, before anyone knew who they were, other than the people that saw them. A time that John Lennon said, if you ever really wanted to see the Beatles, you needed to see us in Hamburg, Germany. Those are the real Beatles. So that's a fascinating time when they had a drummer with them before Ringo Starr called Pete Best. And it was a different type of world for the Beatles. Then it varies. There are times that I get excited by when they broke through in America. There are other times that the period they were in India, or the Sgt. Pepper period, or at the very end, the sad moments of when you saw this incredible band that did so much in only 7 years, a catalog of songs that still sells more than any artist today. Over the last 60 years, 50 years, there's only been one artist who has sold in a decade as much as the Beatles, and that was Eminem in the 1990s.
Eminem.
From 90 to 2000, Eminem sold more than the Beatles, but the Beatles came in second place. From 2000 to 2010, they sold more records than anyone. In the 1980s, they sold more than anyone. 1970s. The issue is that they stopped recording in 1970, and they continue to sell more than any other artist.
Which is an impressive feat, no doubt.
It's a testament, certainly.
Now, the Beatles moved through Europe, they toured all over there, and then they first came to America with the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yes.
How did that come about for them?
With most things with the Beatles, it was all happenstance. They were very, very fortunate. It's almost like the stars were always aligned for them, and things fell into place properly. Ed Sullivan, the man who was the host of the Ed Sullivan Show, happened to be passing through Heathrow Airport in London, or whatever it was called at that time. And he saw these throngs and throngs of teenagers, tens of thousands of teenagers that were there. And he questioned, what's going on? Is the Prime Minister coming through? Is President Johnson coming through? What's going on? And they said it was a rock band called the Beatles. And he had his producers investigate it, and he decided, this is worth a break. They were only popular in Britain. They weren't popular anywhere else. And he booked them in like November of 1963 to come to America for 3 shows. And remarkably, they were paid $6,500 total for those 3 shows.
That doesn't seem like a lot, but then when you think about what that show did for them,
right,
it's the world.
Yeah, it was short-term gain, but long-term gain, really.
One thing that the Beatles also did, which is kind of sort of in line with the period, but also isn't, is that they were film stars at the time. Now, back in the day when films would have musicians in them, it was just for the music, for someone to bring you to the theater. But again, the Beatles changed this.
They did change it. In the past, a way to sell movies was to put a regular movie, some beach blanket movie of some sort, or even like the Elvis movies. Elvis always played a character in these movies, and they really surrounded the movie around that one person, just so they could have a few hit songs that they could promote in that manner. And then the Beatles came along, and they made a real movie about the Beatles. They played themselves, and the movie was called A Hard Day's Night. And it goes down in film history as, according to, depending on who you talk to, one of the top 20 movies ever made. The famous reviewers Siskel and Ebert, this is on their top 10 list of one of the best movies ever made. And it's in black and white. And it's in black and white. It's not even a color movie.
It's in black and white.
Yeah.
What's your favorite Beatles movie?
I think it would have to be A Hard Day's Night. It's a classic movie, and there's some wonderful scenes, as well as the music is just remarkable. And the soundtrack of A Hard Day's Night is a remarkable soundtrack. It's perfection, actually. It's pop music perfection. Their music got better, but as far as pop music, pure pop music, it was exquisite, and it showed them at their peak.
Halfway through the Beatles' career, they lost their longtime manager, Brian Epstein. How much do you think his death affected the band and their music?
I think ultimately what happened to the Beatles was going to happen to the Beatles anyways, but it happened quicker. Brian Epstein was the rudder that steered the ship, and he did that for about 5 years. I think it was about 5 years before that he was actually involved with the Beatles. They knew nothing about the business world. They knew nothing about touring, although they had finished touring by the time he had finished. Record contracts, relationships with record companies, he did all of that. So it really stunned them, and they had no rudder anymore. And so they started going, well, rudderless. And as you know, if you ever see a motorboat that doesn't have a rudder on it, it starts going in circles or making S's and things. And that's what they were doing. And it was a question of who was going to take over this band. Was it going to be Paul McCartney? Was it going to be John Lennon, whose band it originally was? It certainly wasn't going to be George Harrison or Ringo Starr. And it turned out that Paul McCartney really took the reins and took off with that.
Now, right after Brian Epstein died, Magical Mystery Tour happened. Was that a flop at the time? Was that a failure for them?
It was an absolute failure. It was actually considered by most to be the first failure that they had. That was probably 1967 or 68, and they had not had a flop, whether it be a record or anything, since 1963. So it was a wake-up call. One of the most amazing points of that is I mentioned about a colorful set and all. One of the reasons that Magical Mystery Tour was going to be spectacular is because it's all very psychedelic. The colors are real rich, and it's vibrant, and it's quick cutting, and there's a lot of fancy hippie kind of psychedelic stuff happening. When it first aired on British television, because it wasn't a movie, it was a TV show, they aired it in black and white nationally. And so as bad as it was, people perceived it as even worse.
Because it was in black and white.
Because it was in black and white, yeah, at that point. If you look at it now, restored color, the song segments are beautiful. The rest of the story, there really isn't a story. And by the way, you could, if you take my course, I tell you all these things. You didn't mention them.
I didn't mention this yet. Okay, so I have one more question before we talk about the course itself.
That's fine.
Right after Magical Mystery Tour, they recorded 2 more albums. They recorded the Get Back sessions, and they recorded Abbey Road. In your opinion, what did it end for that band? Was it just their time has came, or that was it?
What caused the ending of it?
What caused the ending?
What do you think caused the ending? I think, like anything, George Harrison had an album that came out right after the Beatles called All Things Must Pass.
The big giant box set.
The three CD or 3 record box set. And I think that was true. All things must pass. Everything ends at some point. Even the Beatles had to end. And it had run its course. They had created fantastic music. They were all married at that point. They had their own separate lives. They weren't hanging together all the time. They wanted to play with other people. They wanted to play music with other people. They wanted to do their own thing. Ringo was interested in acting. George Harrison was interested in more mystical Eastern religion type things. John Lennon was only interested in Yoko Ono at the time. And McCartney probably would have kept it together longer, but he was outvoted at that point.
McCartney was actually the one who publicly said, "We're done."
We're done, yes. Surprisingly, all of them had quit, and no one knew it, starting in 1967. First it was Ringo that quit, then it was Harrison that quit, then it was Lennon that quit, but they were always coaxed to come back into the band. And the public never heard about it. That comes out with history now. We learn about that through history. And yet, when the time came to dissolve the band, it was McCartney that came out and said, "I'm done." And so he got all the publicity for being
And he
the
did
one.
that in a really interesting, very Paul-like way, too, how he quit the band.
Yeah. Now, I know you took my course,
Uh-huh.
so let's see if you remember how it happened.
How it happened?
Yes.
Okay, so Paul McCartney released his first solo album, and inside the sleeve that he sent to record companies was an interview of Paul McCartney by Paul McCartney. And inside that interview, I believe, he was asked, will you be recording with the Beatles again? No. Is the band over? Yes. And they were just single-worded answers
Yes.
for him quitting the band.
Yeah. Did I give you an A for the grade?
I think you did,
Okay,
yeah.
'cause you
I don't think I
deserve it.
deserved that.
For
Did I
remembering
deserve
that,
it?
yes.
Okay.
For deserving it.
I'm
For
glad I
remembering that,
deserved
you
it.
deserve it, yes.
All right, now let's talk about the class now. You
Yes.
offer it here at Worcester State. It's
Yes.
being offered again in the spring. How do people sign up for your class?
It's offered through the communications department, so it's in the catalog. It's an elective, so it's not a mandated course for the communications department. And what students can expect is a rigorous education on the Beatles. This is not a gut class. This has a lot of reading in it, and the tests reflect that also.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is, the readings are fantastic. I know they're fantastic readings. In the class, the visuals you're going to see are my lecture, certainly, but I have 12 distinctive PowerPoint presentations that are embedded with tons of music, tons of stills explaining as I'm speaking, as well as lots of footage, including one week, which I love the most, where we sit down and actually, as a class, sit and watch the movie A Hard Day's Night that we spoke about before. Popcorn is optional for that class, but it is available if you want it.
Yeah. Now, we're just about ready to wrap things up.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I do know that you were fascinated with was that last semester you had a student in your class that never heard anything by the Beatles before.
Yes, that's right. And her name was Sushi.
Suchi,
And
yeah.
she was a Chinese exchange student. She was here just one semester. She probably knew 2 or 3 Beatles songs, but she just knew the name the Beatles. And it was the most fascinating experience because I would say all the students knew maybe, out of the catalog of 160, 170 songs, maybe knew 12 to 20 songs. And we play, of course, a lot more than just the hits all the time. We play
We go really into the
we
deep
go
cuts
really
too,
in depth
yeah.
into the catalog. And she had heard almost nothing. So I think the whole class experienced hearing things for the very first time, because I would always ask her what she thought of the song after we played parts of it or all of it in class. And my most memorable moment in the class was at the tail end, the Abbey Road album, which of course you're so familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
There's a song by George Harrison called Something. And many people have said it's one of the most remarkable love songs ever written, both production-wise, lyrically, and musically. And I remember when the song ended, there was dead silence after I played it. And I looked and I said, "Sushi," and she was crying. And she said, "It's the most beautiful song I've ever heard." And I know that meant so much to me, and I think the whole class responded the same way.
No, really.
Yeah.
It was an amazing. I've taken your class. It
Yeah.
was an amazing time,
Yeah.
and I really encourage everybody out there watching this to please, at least, if not take it, think about taking it. It's going to change your life.
Yeah.
It really will.
I'm not sure it'll change your life, but
It kind of changed mine.
okay.
I don't know.
Thank you very much, RJ.
Thank you for being here with us, Steve. Remember, his class is being offered at Worcester State in the spring. So if you like what you heard, please consider joining the class. It's really, really fun.